February 8th, 1945. Peenemünde, a skeletal prisoner, is gripping the controls of a Nazi bomber with all the strength he has left. He weighs barely 40 kilograms. Behind him, 9 fellow inmates cling to the fuselage, exhausted, their breaths thin and fading. German guards in defensive emplacements have opened fire. Bullets punch through the aircraft's skin. A tire bursts. 10 prisoners are making a desperate attempt to steal the bomber and escape Peenemünde, Hitler's most secret island base. No prisoner has ever left this place alive. And here's what the Nazis don't know. The man at the controls was once one of the Soviet Union's most feared fighter pilots. But these inmates, none of them even 45 kilograms, can barely hold a shovel steady. Can they lift a 14-ton bomber off the ground? And what will happen when Soviet forces see the blood-red, deadly Nazi crosses in the skies above their own land? The Baltic Sea screams with knife-sharp winds. Peenemünde lies isolated in frost and haze. A bell clangs, ripping through the silence. At the edge of the runway stands a trembling figure. A filthy, striped uniform wraps a withered body. Cracked hands, bleeding at the seams, are clenched tight. He bears the number 104534. This is no ordinary prison camp. This is the Third Reich's vital nerve center, where the V-1 and V-2 rockets were conceived. Hitler's final gamble. Security is absolute. Tangled high-voltage fences, patrol boats sealing the sea, anti-aircraft guns on constant watch. A fortress that lets nothing in and nothing out. The files record it clearly. Prisoner 104534 is Mikhail Devyataev. For 8 months, he has been thrown into the Death Brigade. Their task? Fill bomb craters by hand under the rifles of guards. Their ration is watery turnip soup and crumbs of bread, under 700 calories a day. Hunger grinds him down, his muscles waste away. Thin skin clings to rib and bone. He looks like a shadow waiting to vanish. And yet those sunken eyes are not empty. They are locked onto one target. The camp commander's Heinkel He 111 bomber. In that walking skeleton, a mad plan is taking shape. Steal the giant machine. How can a ruined body break through the Nazis' steel security net? And the greatest mystery, why would a garbage collector want to take a plane? For years, Nazi Germany, through the Gestapo and the Luftwaffe, had enforced an unbreakable directive regarding prisoners of war. Any Soviet pilot shot down and captured must be classified as among the most dangerous individuals. With sharp military instincts, they were never to be placed in ordinary labor details. Punishment for Soviet pilots had only 2 paths: executed on the spot by the SS to eliminate them, or thrown into hell concentration camps to be worked to death. And yet, 104,534 was a pilot who should have been erased. So why did the Nazis let this prey slip through? Military records confirm the identity of Mikhail Devyataev, born in 1917. He was no ordinary soldier, but a senior lieutenant, a notorious ace of the Soviet Red Army's 104th Guards Fighter Regiment. By the summer of 1944, Devyataev had flown 180 combat sorties and had a personal tally of 9 German aircraft shot down. July 13, 1944, became a turning point of life and death. On an escort mission over Lviv, Devyataev's Yak-1 fighter was drawn into a savage dogfight and overwhelmed by the fire of enemy Focke-Wulf 190s. His plane was hit and burst into flames. He had to bail out, landing with severe burns and a broken leg. The Germans seized him immediately. Interrogation confirmed his rank and identity as a fighter pilot. True to the machinery of death, Devyataev was stamped for execution and shoved onto a cattle car, deported straight to Sachsenhausen, one of Germany's most infamous killing grounds. At Sachsenhausen, Devyataev was confined to a section reserved for condemned prisoners awaiting death. For him, death was now measured in days. Yet beneath the Nazis' brutal rule, a hidden network of Soviet prisoners still operated in silence. Recognizing the value of a master pilot like Devyataev, his countrymen in the camp decided he had to be saved at any cost. The chance appeared in the harshest way possible. A prisoner in the forced labor section nearby collapsed and died of exhaustion. With swift help from a camp barber, someone with the privilege to move between holding areas, a secret identity swap took place in the dark. Devyataev's metal ID tag, stamped with his prisoner number, was removed and hung around the neck of the cold corpse. In exchange, Devyataev took the dead man's tag. The name, Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Devyataev, Soviet fighter pilot, was officially erased from German records. The man who kept breathing, stepping out of the shadows, now carried a new identity. Grigory Nikitenko. Nikitenko's file stated he had been an elementary school teacher back home, mobilized as an anonymous infantry private. No specialized mechanical or military skills. The Nazi bureaucracy was rigid and rule-bound. It trusted utterly in the numbers stamped on steel tags and the papers in its archives. The cover of Teacher Nikitenko shielded Devyataev from the firing squads. By October 1944, when the Germans needed large numbers of expendable laborers for dangerous construction, they loaded Nikitenko's group onto a train and transferred them to the Peenemünde rocket base on Usedom Island. Beneath a 38-kilogram frame, the pilot's cold, sharp eyes didn't see German aircraft as lifeless machines. He was calculating something. A gap that lasted exactly 30 minutes? What was that gap? Winter 1944 at Peenemünde was a brutal test of patience and tactical vision. After months of forced labor, Devyataev's keen eyes had identified a rule the Germans followed without exception. Mechanical discipline. At exactly 12 o'clock noon every day, when the brake whistle sounded across the island, something strange happened. Every guard, technician, and mechanic left their posts at the same time and headed toward the mess hall. The Germans' absolute obedience to the clock created an equally absolute security void. For precisely 30 minutes, the aircraft parking area and runway, normally bustling, became an empty no-man's land. To Devyataev, those 30 minutes were not lunch. They were a priceless golden window for the most insane escape plan of the war. The target was a Heinkel. U-111 marked Gustav Anton, a heavy twin-engine bomber, and the personal aircraft of Peenemunde's base commander. It was perfect. Always fueled for emergency missions, with enough space to carry many people. But the technical challenge was terrifying. Devyataev was accustomed to the Soviet Yak-1, a single-engine fighter. The He-111 was a foreign monster, its cockpit crowded with hundreds of switches and gauges labeled entirely in Gothic German. So Devyataev began learning to fly by hand, inside enemy territory. While clearing rubble from bombed aircraft wrecks, he secretly removed instruction panels, hid them in his torn clothing, and brought them back to the barracks to study under the dim winter candlelight. He slowly translated each line, memorized the position of every switch by touch. He even dared to stand near planes with engines running to watch German pilots' hands, counting how many levers they pushed, how many knobs they turned, and in what order before the aircraft began to roll. Quietly, Devyataev recruited the most trustworthy inmates from different work details. Luck favored him. He gathered 9 men, including 2 invaluable recruits, mechanic Vladimir Sokolov and Ivan Krivonogov. 10 starving, depleted men, none heavier than 45 kilograms, made a death oath together. All of them would fly home, or all of them would die on the runway. The moment was set for February 8th, 1945. At noon, when the guards left their posts, would they dare seize the chance? Would one unexpected variable be enough to collapse everything? Peenemünde, escape or be trapped? Devyataev and the 9 others moved according to plan. First, they overpowered the supervisors and took their uniforms. Then one member dressed in the stolen outfit to deceive distant guard posts, allowing the group to reach the area where the Heinkel 111 sat. They climbed into the aircraft in complete silence. Devyataev took the pilot's seat, his bony hands moving over the engine start controls in the sequence he had drilled into memory for 4 months. But theory and practice are worlds apart. After minutes of holding their breath and fumbling with the unfamiliar system, Devyataev pressed the starter. Nothing. No roar. Only a terrifying silence that filled the cockpit. Their 30 golden minutes were draining away mercilessly. The SS could return at any moment, and the Nazis' guns would be a guaranteed death sentence. The clock struck 12:15. Cold sweat ran down Mikhail Devyataev's forehead. He realized the missing piece of information he could never have predicted. A strict internal security procedure. To prevent theft and electrical shorts that could cause fires or explosions, the mechanics always removed the battery and stored it elsewhere whenever a flying shift ended. Panic surged through the cockpit. From behind came stifled sobs. Devyataev scanned the runway through the windshield and spotted a cart carrying a spare battery sitting alone some distance away. There was no other option. Several frail prisoners had to risk everything and rush out of the aircraft. They strained to drag the heavy iron cart across the icy snow, fully exposed in the middle of the open runway. They connected the cables in frantic haste. When power flowed into the system, Devyataev pressed the starter again. This time, ignition caught. The left engine coughed, spat black smoke, then found its rhythm. Then, the right engine. Both machines shuddered and roared, tearing apart the island's lunchtime silence. That engine roar was a death bell. SS men and guards in the mess hall jolted, abandoned their meal, and poured outside. Alarms screamed. Carabiner 98K rifles cracked, firing toward the aircraft as it began to move. Inside the cockpit, Devyataev gritted his teeth and slammed both throttles forward. The Heinkel tore down the snow-covered runway, leaving behind German troops scrambling in pursuit. The alarm was already wailing. Could they clear the runway before the first lethal bursts found them? The Heinkel thundered over the snow. Would the moment the wheels lifted carry them off the island, or drag them all into disaster? Inside the cramped cockpit of the Heinkel, a 111 Gustav Anton, the air was thick with oil and fuel smoke. Mikhail Devyataev watched the speed needle begin to dance, climbing with the roar of the twin Jumo 211 engines. The 14-ton war machine shook violently, charging forward like a wounded beast. They had reached takeoff speed, yet the nose still refused to rise. To lift a flying fortress like the Heinkel 111, a normal pilot needed about 23 kilograms of pulling force. Devyataev's body was now little more than a moving corpse, the result of 8 months of being worked to the bone and starved without end. His muscles were gone, replaced by pale tendons and a failing frame. "Up! Please, up!" Devyataev hissed through clenched teeth. He poured his last scraps of strength into it, bracing with the rudder pedals and yanking the controls hard toward his chest. The runway was shrinking with every frantic heartbeat. At the end was not open sky, but high-voltage fences and the frozen Baltic Sea. If the nose didn't lift in the next seconds, all 10 would be smashed into metal shards. Devyataev screamed. Instantly, from behind the cockpit, Vladimir Sokolov and Ivan Krivanogov, 2 more gaunt ghosts, lunged forward. They said nothing. 6 bony hands clamped onto the controls. 6 legs drove hard against the bulkhead. Men on the edge of starvation were wrestling a 14-ton steel monster. And then, they won. The Heinkel's nose slowly rose. The wheels shrieked one last time and left the ground, missing the electrified fence by less than 2 meters. The base commander's aircraft climbed into the air as SS troops stared in disbelief. They had no time to celebrate. The alarm rang across the island. A German Focke-Wulf fighter took off immediately in pursuit with one order: shoot it down at any cost. But in the chaos, the German pilot had taken off so hastily that he forgot to load ammunition. Devyataev seized the chance, throwing the bulky bomber into a sharp, daring turn and plunging straight into thick cloud layers to break contact. With only a torn map they had scavenged and the faint guidance of the pale winter sun, Devyataev steered east. For an hour, not one of the 10 men in the cabin dared to breathe loudly. More than 400 kilometers passed, and at last the dark green forests of the Soviet motherland appeared beneath the wings. It seemed they were safe, until the cruelest irony revealed itself. On the ground, Soviet anti-aircraft gunners saw only a bomber bearing the deadly swastika crosses racing toward them. To them, it was a target that had to be destroyed. Flak erupted upward. The Heinkel shuddered. The right engine was hit and burst into flames. Thick, black smoke flooded the cockpit, blinding their view. "Don't shoot! We're your own!" Devyataev roared helplessly through the explosions. He knew he couldn't keep flying. In the fire-choked haze, he used every remaining shred of skill to force an emergency belly landing. The plane slammed down, plowing through a field of white snow, carving a long, scorched trail before grinding to a stop. The cockpit door flew open. 10 men, limbs shaking, crawled out of the wreckage. They collapsed into the freezing snow. A Soviet soldier, rifle raised, ran toward them. They had reached the threshold of home. But would they be met with saving arms? Or a wrongful verdict no one would ever clear? The moment the Heinkel's cockpit door opened, Devyataev stepped into a new prison. Under Stalin, a harsh military doctrine ruled, in the Red Army, there are no prisoners of war, only traitors. 10 emaciated men pulling off a sensational escape from the Nazis' most secret base sounded less like truth than an intelligence plot. The NKVD immediately ordered them restrained. They were thrown into isolated cells and subjected to interrogations that dragged on for months. Investigators did not believe Devyataev's miracle. They believed this was a group of agents trained by the Nazis and sent back to infiltrate the Soviet ranks. The fate of the 10 men split into tragic paths. Devyataev's 9 companions were stripped of honor, never recognized as escapees, treated instead as guilty men. They were sent to penal battalions, suicide units forced to charge first into the fiercest battles to redeem themselves in blood. War's cruelty claimed most of them at the gates of Berlin, where they fell and never returned. Mikhail Devyataev, as the pilot, was placed under special scrutiny. He was stripped of his rank, expelled, and deprived of every right as an aviator. Back in his hometown of Kazan, he was shunned, branded a traitor, and forced to survive on hard manual labor, hauling cargo at the docks. For 12 long years, he lived quietly in the shadow of suspicion. In 1957, the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States entered a decisive stage. Sergei Korolev, chief designer, father of the Soviet space program, was struggling to decipher Germany's WWII rocket technology. Korolev discovered Devyataev's aircraft had not been an ordinary command plane. It carried special radio systems used to control and measure ballistic missile test launches. More importantly, Devyataev was the only living witness who had worked directly at the rocket launch site on Usedom. He had memorized the exact coordinates of the bunkers, the layout of the assembly workshops, and the operating procedures of Peenemunde's launch platform. Information Soviet intelligence could not obtain from any other source. Recognizing the priceless value of the so-called traitor, now working as a dock laborer in Kazan, Korolev personally intervened. He wrote directly to the highest levels of the Soviet government, stating that without Devyataev's data, the R-1 missile program, the foundation for later success in launching Sputnik, would have taken years longer to complete. At last, the truth of the unbelievable flight on February 8, 1945, was brought into the light. On August 15, 1957, Mikhail Petrovich Devyataev was officially rehabilitated. In a solemn ceremony, he received the highest honor, Hero of the Soviet Union. This late vindication did more than restore one man's dignity. It stood as an indictment of blind suspicion that had crushed 10 courageous men. Mikhail Devyataev lived until 2002, the last survivor of the 10 prisoners. Until his final breath, he never forgot the 8 seconds of life and death at the end of the Peenemünde runway, when 3 half-starved men clung to the controls to lift a 14-ton machine into the sky. His life proved a profound paradox. Sometimes escaping the enemy's guns is only the beginning. The real test is the long struggle to defend an honest person's dignity against the harshness of an era. The flight ended, but the lesson of will and perseverance still echoes through history. Devyataev's story is not only a prison break by bomber, it is a lesson in how a person stands upright against 3 greatest enemies: circumstance, fear, and suspicion. He didn't wait for perfect conditions. He observed the Germans' clockwork discipline, found the golden 30 minutes, collected scraps of paper and symbols, memorized the cockpit panel, and turned knowledge into a weapon. In the dark, when the engines wouldn't start because the battery had been removed, he didn't collapse. He pivoted instantly and chose the only path that could keep them alive. It's a hard, human lesson. A plan matters only if you prepare for deviation. What saves you is often not scenario A, but a cool head that can pull out scenario B in the middle of pounding heartbeats. And when two fellow prisoners rushed in, 6 hands gripping the controls, the impossible became possible. A person can be weak, but unity can be stronger than steel. If there had been only one hero, everything would have ended at the electrified fence. The vow, fly home together or die together, became the Heigel's third engine. And the cruelest lesson of all, escaping the enemy isn't always the end. Sometimes the real battle begins when you return. A person's truth can be buried. You can survive and still fall into another prison. The prison of prejudice, suspicion, cold conclusions. The lesson here is not only courage, but endurance in protecting dignity. A man may win in 8 seconds of life and death, but still have to win again, silently, for 12 years under doubtful eyes. So what remains in the end is this. Willpower is not only a moment of explosion. Willpower is the long endurance that keeps going until truth is finally called by its right name. Devyataev's honor was restored in 1957. Late, but not meaningless. And sometimes, what is greatest is not the takeoff itself, but the fact that a human being refuses to be bent by their time.